I swear on everything I own, I saw Madam and Kofi holding hands near the garden last night, like teenagers sneaking around. Not just walking, but standing there, close, like they were about to kiss. And then they did. Madam kissed him, right there in the open, under the moonlight. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I mean, Madam. The same Madam who only speaks to us when she has to. And Kofi, the gateman who fixes broken locks with wire and barely smiles. I almost dropped the plate of jollof rice I was carrying. That's what I told my cousin the next morning, and I'm not even exaggerating. I had seen it with my own eyes, and still, I couldn't believe it. This was Madam, rich, classy Madam, whose late husband was a big man in government, the kind of man people still talk about in hushed tones at parties. Madam, who always wore her head high and her clothes perfectly pressed, as if wrinkles were beneath her. She wasn't the type you'd imagine falling for someone like Kofi. Kofi, on the other hand, was the exact opposite. Quiet, plain, hardworking. He was always at the gate, either fixing something, sweeping, or sitting on his old wooden stool, looking out at the road like he was watching life pass by. He didn't talk much, didn't laugh much, didn't do anything to draw attention to himself. He was just there. Solid. Reliable. Invisible, almost. So when I saw them together, it felt like the universe had flipped upside down. Madam, with her gold bangles jangling on her wrist, standing there with Kofi, his faded uniform barely fitting his broad shoulders. It wasn't just the kiss that shocked me, it was the way they looked at each other. Like they were seeing something no one else could see. Something private. Something real. I couldn't keep it to myself. How could I? The staff would have noticed eventually, and it's not like I wanted to gossip, but this was too big to keep quiet. By lunchtime, everyone in the house was buzzing. The housekeeper whispered to me in the kitchen, "Do you think it's true?" Madam and Kofi. The driver overheard us and chuckled, shaking his head. That man. What does he have to offer her? But beneath the jokes, you could feel the tension. Everyone was curious. Everyone had an opinion. The next day, I saw it again. Madam brought Kofi a plate of food, not leftovers from the kitchen, but something she had made herself. Groundnut soup with pounded yam. I only knew because I'd helped her in the kitchen earlier. It's his favorite, she'd said casually, as if it was the most normal thing in the world for her to cook for the gateman. When she handed him the plate, Kofi looked stunned. He muttered a thank you, his voice barely above a whisper, and for a second, he just stared at her like he didn't know what to do. And then he smiled. Not the polite, distant smile we were used to, but a real smile, warm and unguarded. That was the moment I realized this wasn't some passing thing. This was something deeper. But not everyone saw it that way. The other staff started talking more openly, and the rumors spread beyond the house. Madam's friends came by one afternoon for tea, and I overheard one of them say, "Are you sure you know what you're doing? People are talking." Madam didn't flinch. She just sipped her tea and said, "Let them talk. They've been talking all my life." Her confidence was admirable, but the whispers didn't stop. One day, the driver came to me, fuming. "This thing she's doing will bring trouble," he said. "People won't respect her anymore. She's a rich widow, for God's sake. How can she lower herself like this?" I didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure if he was right or wrong. All I knew was that every time I saw Madam and Kofi together, they seemed happy. Happier than I'd ever seen either of them before. One evening, after most of the staff had gone home, I found myself sitting on the back steps of the house, watching them from a distance. Madam was leaning against the gate, laughing at something Kofi had said. He wasn't laughing, but the way he looked at her, like she was the most precious thing in the world, was enough to make my chest ache. It was a kind of love you didn't see often. Quiet, steady, and unshakable. As the weeks went on, their relationship became impossible to ignore. Madam started spending more time outside, near the gate. Kofi started dressing neater, his uniform always freshly pressed. He even started speaking more confidently, his voice carrying a new kind of assurance. It was like they were both transforming, bit by bit, just by being around each other. And then came the big announcement. One morning, Madam gathered all the staff in the living room. She stood tall, her gold earrings catching the sunlight, and said, "I want you all to know that Kofi and I are together. If anyone has a problem with that, you can come to me directly." Her tone left no room for argument, but the room still buzzed with unspoken questions. Nobody said a word, but the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Over time, the whispers died down. People adjusted. Some even started to admire them. Madam and Kofi didn't flaunt their relationship, but they didn't hide it either. They were just themselves. Two people who found each other in a world that didn't think they should. And honestly, watching them made me believe in love in a way I hadn't before. Real love. The kind that doesn't care about status or expectations. The kind that just is. Months passed, and life in the house found a strange new rhythm. Madam and Kofi became a part of each other's routines in ways that were subtle but undeniable. She would sit outside in the evenings, reading a book while he tinkered with the gate or swept the driveway. Sometimes, she'd hand him a glass of water, and they'd share a quiet moment before going back to whatever they were doing. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was real. One day, Madam's family visited, her late husband's younger brother and his wife. They were important people, the kind who wore their wealth like armor. They sat stiffly in the living room, sipping tea and exchanging polite pleasantries. But then, as Kofi walked past the doorway to retrieve something from the garden, the atmosphere shifted. The uncle narrowed his eyes, and his wife leaned forward slightly, as if she had just spotted something scandalous. "Who's that?" the uncle asked, his voice heavy with suspicion. Madam didn't even blink. "That's Kofi. My partner." The room went silent. The aunt's teacup rattled against its saucer, and the uncle's face turned a shade darker. "Partner," he repeated, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Yes," Madam said firmly, meeting his gaze. "Partner." What followed was a lecture disguised as concern. They talked about reputation, about appearances, about how her late husband would be rolling in his grave. Madam listened calmly, her face unreadable, and when they were done, she simply said, "Thank you for your concern, but my life is my own." They left shortly after, their expression sour. But Madam didn't seem fazed. That night, I saw her sitting in the garden with Kofi, her head resting on his shoulder. Whatever they said to each other was too soft for me to hear, but the way she leaned into him told me she wasn't about to let anyone dictate her happiness. Of course, the drama didn't stop there. The news of Madam and Kofi's relationship spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People gossiped at the market, at church, even at the salon. "How can she, with all her money, choose someone like him?" they asked. "Is she bewitched?" But Madam didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed lighter, freer, as if she'd shed a weight she'd been carrying for years. Kofi, too, started to change. He began taking night classes, studying basic business management. He said Madam encouraged him, told him he was capable of more. "She believes in me," he told me one day, his voice filled with quiet pride. "No one's ever done that before." I think that was the part that softened the rest of us. At first, we couldn't understand it, why Madam, with all her privilege, would choose Kofi. But as time went on, it became clear that they weren't just a mismatched pair. They were a team. She brought him confidence, he brought her peace. Together, they seemed to balance each other in a way that made perfect sense, even if no one else saw it that way. By the end of the year, Madam made another announcement. This time, it wasn't just to the staff but to everyone she cared about. She and Kofi were getting married. The reactions were mixed, some supportive, some scandalized. Her family threatened to disown her, her friends shook their heads in disbelief. But Madam stood her ground. The wedding was small and private, held in the garden where it all began. She wore a simple dress, nothing like the grand gowns she'd worn in her past life. Kofi looked nervous but proud, his suit a little too big but his smile wide enough to make up for it. When they said their vows, there wasn't a dry eye among us, not because it was a fairy tale, but because it was real. Imperfect, unconventional, but undeniably real. After the ceremony, as they walked back to the house hand in hand, I overheard Madam say to Kofi, "They'll never understand, and that's okay. I don't need them to. I have you." And in that moment, I realized something. Love doesn't follow rules or expectations. It doesn't care about wealth or status or what people think. Love is simply two people finding something in each other that they can't find anywhere else. And if that's not worth fighting for, I don't know what is. The days following the wedding were, surprisingly, quieter than anyone expected. It was as if the whole world had held its breath, waiting for some kind of scandal or fallout, and when nothing dramatic happened, people simply moved on. Well, most of them did. There were still whispers here and there. Some of Madam's old friends stopped visiting entirely, their absence a silent protest. A few relatives called to check in, their concern laced with judgment. But Madam didn't seem to mind. She had made her choice, and she was happy with it. And if there was one thing Madam had always been, it was firm. Once she decided something, she never looked back. Kofi, on the other hand, was a little more cautious. He still did his work around the house, though now he shared responsibilities with a new gateman Madam had hired. "You're my husband, not my staff," she had told him, but Kofi wasn't the type to sit idle. He insisted on helping out, even if it was just to keep himself busy. But you could tell he was adjusting. Slowly. One evening, I saw him sitting on the veranda, a thick book open on his lap. It wasn't one of the usual magazines or old newspapers he used to read. This was a proper book, with chapters and everything. When I asked him about it, he grinned, a rare, unguarded grin that lit up his face. "Madam, sorry, my wife says I should read more," he said, stumbling slightly over the word wife like he wasn't used to saying it yet. "She says knowledge is power." I couldn't help but laugh. "And do you believe her?" He nodded, his face growing serious. "I do. She's changed my life. How can I not believe her?" And it was true. You could see the change in him, in both of them. Madam, who had always carried herself with a kind of distant elegance, now seemed warmer, more approachable. She laughed more, and not the polite, restrained laugh she used to share with her friends, but a real, belly-deep laugh that echoed through the house. And Kofi, who had always seemed like a part of the background, now stood taller, spoke clearer, and even started cracking jokes with the staff. It was like they had found something in each other that made them both better. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. One day, while I was out at the market, I overheard two women talking about Madam and Kofi. "It's a disgrace," one of them said, shaking her head. "She could have had anyone. Why him?" The other woman shrugged. "Maybe she didn't want anyone. Maybe she just wanted him." Their conversation stuck with me. It reminded me of something Madam had said during a quiet moment in the kitchen. "Do you know why I fell in love with Kofi?" she'd asked, her hands busy slicing vegetables. I had shaken my head, too curious to interrupt. She paused for a moment, as if searching for the right words, and then said, "Because he sees me. Not my money, not my reputation, just me." And that's something I hadn't felt in a very long time. It was a simple answer, but it made sense. The kind of sense that stays with you, even when the world around you is full of noise. Life went on, and so did their love story. It wasn't perfect, no love story is. They had their disagreements, their moments of doubt. Kofi struggled to adjust to a life where he wasn't just a gateman but a husband to a woman whose life had always been so far removed from his own. Madam, too, had her moments of insecurity, wondering if the world would ever stop judging them. But they always found their way back to each other. One evening, a few months after the wedding, I saw them sitting together in the garden. Madam was resting her head on Kofi's shoulder, her eyes closed, while he read aloud from a book. His voice was steady, his words slow and deliberate, and she listened like it was the most natural thing in the world. The moonlight cast a soft glow over them, and for a moment, they looked like they were in their own little world, untouched by the chaos of everything else. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just a story about a rich woman falling for her gateman. It wasn't about class or money or what people thought. It was about two people who found each other in a world that tried to keep them apart. Two people who chose love, not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. As I watched them, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Because if they could make it work, against all odds, against all expectations, then maybe love really was as powerful as the old story said. And maybe, just maybe, it was something we all deserved to find. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday, just when things seemed to have settled into a quiet rhythm. A black SUV pulled up to the gate in the early afternoon, its windows tinted so dark you couldn't see who was inside. Kofi stepped out to open the gate as usual, but instead of driving through, the car stopped, and the passenger door opened. It was Madam's eldest sister, Auntie Grace. Auntie Grace wasn't someone who needed an introduction. She was tall, with sharp cheekbones and a gaze that could freeze water. The kind of woman who walked into a room and made everyone sit up a little straighter. And she wasn't happy. You could tell by the way her lips pressed into a thin line as she stepped out of the car, her gold earrings glinting in the sun. "Where's your madam?" she asked Kofi, her voice crisp and clipped. Kofi, to his credit, stood his ground. "She's inside, Ma." Auntie Grace didn't wait for an invitation. She marched past him, her heels clicking against the driveway, her presence radiating the kind of authority that made even the mango trees seem to bow. I followed quietly, my heart thudding in my chest. This wasn't going to end well. Inside, Madam was sitting in the living room, sipping tea and reading a newspaper. She looked up as her sister stormed in, her expression shifting from surprise to calm in the blink of an eye. "Grace," she said, setting the cup down. "What a pleasant surprise." "Don't play coy with me," Auntie Grace snapped, throwing her handbag onto the couch. "What is this nonsense I'm hearing about you and that man? That gateman?" Madam's expression didn't change. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and said, "If you're referring to Kofi, yes, we are married." Auntie Grace's jaw dropped. For a moment, she looked like she couldn't decide whether to laugh or scream. "Married? To him? Have you lost your mind? Do you know what people are saying? What they are calling you?" "I don't care," Madam said simply. Her voice was steady, but there was still underneath it. "Let them say what they want." The argument that followed was intense. Auntie Grace threw everything she had at Madam: shame, guilt, family duty, even religion. She painted pictures of scandal, of ruined reputations, of children pointing at them in the streets. But Madam didn't budge. She sat there, calm and composed, her words as sharp as her sister's but delivered with quiet dignity. I didn't marry Kofi for anyone else's approval, she said finally, her voice rising just enough to make Auntie Grace stop pacing. I married him because he makes me happy. And if you can't understand that, then I don't know what else to tell you. The silence that followed was deafening. Auntie Grace looked at her for a long moment, her face a mix of anger and something else, something softer, almost like sadness. And then, without another word, she picked up her handbag and walked out. For the rest of the day, the house felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Kofi kept to himself, quietly fixing a fence in the backyard, while Madam stayed in her room. It wasn't until later that evening, when the stars had started to come out, that I saw them together. They were sitting on the porch steps, close but not touching. Madam was staring up at the sky, her face unreadable, while Kofi fiddled with a piece of string in his hands. "Do you think it's worth it?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Kofi looked at her, his expression serious. "You're worth it," he said simply. And just like that, the tension seemed to melt away. Madam leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there in the quiet, the weight of the world still pressing down but not breaking them. The next morning, Auntie Grace called. She didn't apologize, not exactly, but her tone was softer. She asked how Madam was doing, if she needed anything. And though she didn't mention Kofi, it was clear she wasn't going to fight the relationship anymore. Not openly, at least. From that point on, things began to shift. Slowly, subtly, but surely. The neighbors who had whispered behind their back started nodding in greeting when they passed. Some of Madam's old friends came back, bringing bottles of wine and awkward smiles. Even the staff, who had once looked at Kofi with skepticism, started treating him with a quiet respect. It wasn't that the world had fully accepted them, far from it. There were still stares, still muttered comments at the market. But Madam and Kofi didn't seem to care. They built a life together, piece by piece, in defiance of everything and everyone who said they shouldn't. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. Years later, when I left the house to start my own little business, I visited them one last time. Kofi greeted me at the gate, his smile as wide as ever, and led me to the garden where Madam was tending to her roses. She looked up when she saw me, her face lighting up in a way that made her look years younger. "How's the business?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good," I said. "Thanks to everything you taught me." She smiled and glanced at Kofi, who was watching her with that same quiet adoration I'd seen the very first time I caught them together. "It's not about what people think," she said, almost to herself. "It's about what makes you happy." And in that moment, I knew she was right. Because there they were, two people who shouldn't have walked, who shouldn't have even been in the same world, let alone the same life. But they had found each other. And that was all that mattered. The turning point that changed everything came completely out of the blue. One day, Madam and Kofi received an unexpected letter. It was written on thick, expensive paper and delivered by hand, already unusual enough. But what made it even stranger was the sender, the Chenery Foundation, a prestigious organization known for honoring people who made significant contributions to their communities. We all gathered in the living room as Madam opened it. Her hands were steady, but her expression flickered with curiosity. As her eyes scanned the letter, her face softened into something I hadn't seen before, disbelief mixed with joy. "What does it say?" Kofi asked, standing close but not crowding her. They want to honor us," Madam said, her voice tinged with surprise. "For showing that love can transcend barriers." The room went silent. For a moment, it felt like everyone had stopped breathing. Then the housekeeper clapped her hands, the driver let out a low whistle, and I couldn't help but grin. The Chenery Foundation wasn't just any organization, it was a symbol of integrity and respect. For them to recognize Madam and Kofi was like the universe itself saying, "You did good." But the suspense didn't end there. The ceremony was scheduled for a month later, and the whole house buzzed with activity. Madam's siblings, even Auntie Grace, pitched in to help. They wanted to be there, to celebrate the couple they had once doubted. Kofi, ever humble, insisted on keeping things low-key, but Madam wouldn't hear of it. "This isn't just about us," she told him. "It's about everyone who's ever been told their love wasn't enough." The big day arrived, and the venue, a sprawling outdoor garden with fairy lights twinkling overhead, was packed. Friends, family, neighbors, and even some of the very people who had once whispered behind their backs showed up. The atmosphere was electric, full of anticipation. When it was their turn to take the stage, the applause was deafening. Madam, dressed in a simple but elegant gown, walked up with Kofi by her side, looking sharp in a perfectly tailored suit. For a moment, they just stood there, taking it all in, before Madam stepped forward to speak. "I was told once," she began, her voice clear and steady, "that love isn't always about what makes sense to the world. It's about what makes sense to your heart. And in a world full of noise and judgment, Kofi taught me that happiness doesn't need anyone else's permission." The crowd erupted into applause, but she wasn't done. "There were days when the stares, the whispers, and even my own doubts felt overwhelming," she continued. "But when I looked at Kofi, at the way he loved me, respected me, and believed in me, I knew we were stronger than the noise." Then, turning to Kofi, she said, "You've given me more than I ever thought I could have again. Thank you for reminding me that love doesn't just survive, it thrives." Kofi, who rarely spoke in public, stepped forward and took the microphone. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. "I never thought someone like me would be standing here with someone like her," he said, glancing at Madam with a shy smile. "But she saw me when no one else did. And that's all I'll ever need." The audience was on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears. And in that moment, it was clear, they weren't just a couple who defied expectations. They were a symbol of what love could be when it was pure, honest, and brave. But the final twist came after the ceremony. As the crowd began to thin out, a man approached them, one of the trustees of the Chenery Foundation. He shook Kofi's hand and said, "Your story is inspiring, but your work is even more so. We've decided to fund your dream project." Kofi blinked, confused. "Dream project?" The man smiled. "Madam told us about your idea to start a community training center for underprivileged youth. A place where they can learn skills, find work, and build better lives. It's a beautiful vision, and we want to make it happen." Kofi turned to Madam, his eyes wide. She shrugged with a mischievous smile. "You've always talked about giving back," she said. "Now's your chance." And just like that, their love story turned into something bigger, something that didn't just inspire those around them but created lasting change. The community center opened 6 months later, with Kofi at the helm and Madam as his biggest supporter. It became a beacon of hope, a place where anyone, no matter their background, could find opportunity. And as they stood together at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, surrounded by laughter and cheers, it was clear their love had grown into something unstoppable. So, if you're ever doubting what's possible in love or in life, remember Madam and Kofi. Remember how they stood tall against judgment, how they chose each other despite the odds, and how their love didn't just survive, it thrived, transforming not just their lives but the lives of everyone around them. And now, I leave you with this: what would happen if we all loved like Madam and Kofi? What if we dared to break the rules, to follow our hearts, and to build something that the world said couldn't exist? Maybe, just maybe, we'd all find the kind of happiness that lasts forever. Before you go, let me ask you something: did this story stir something in you? Did it make you pause, reflect, or even smile a little? Stories like this remind us of the power of love, resilience, and the unexpected beauty of life. If it moved you, even for a moment, you're exactly where you belong. Here on this channel, we're all about bringing you stories that touch the heart and ignite the mind. Whether it's love, inspiration, or life's unforgettable twist, we're here to keep you coming back for more. But the truth is, we can't grow this community without you. So, if you felt a connection with this story, if it made you think, feel, or just gave you a reason to stay a little longer, here's how you can show some love. Backhand index pointing right, hit that subscribe button. Become part of this journey, so you never miss another story that could inspire your day. Backhand index pointing right, click like, not just for us, but for yourself. Let it be a little token of saying, I enjoyed this. Backhand index pointing right, and most importantly, share it. Share it with someone who could use a little reminder that love and courage can change everything. We're building something special here, and it only works if you're part of it. So stay close, because the next story, it might be even better.